Else's hole was a lot deeper than his. He couldn't actually see their holes, but could tell by the size of their dirt piles. He saw a cloud of dust moving across the wasteland and noticed that the other boys had stopped digging and were watching it too. The dirt cloud moved closer, and he could see that it trailed behind a red pickup truck. The truck stopped near where they were digging, and the boys lined up behind it. X-Ray in front, Zero at the rear. Stanley got in line behind Zero. Mr. Sir filled each of their canteens from a tank of water in the bed of the pickup. As he took Stanley's canteen from him, he said, "This isn't the Girl Scouts, is it?" Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. Mr. Sir followed Stanley back to his hole to see how he was doing. "You better get with it," he said, "or else you're going to be digging in the hottest part of the day." He popped some of the sunflower seeds into his mouth, deftly removed the shells with his teeth, and spat them into Stanley's hole. Every day, Elia carried the little piglet up the mountain and sang to it as it drank from the stream. As the pig grew fatter, Elia grew stronger. One day of Myra's 15th birthday, Elia's pig weighed over 50 stones. Madame Zeroni had told him to carry the pig up the mountain on that day as well, but Elia didn't want to present himself to Myra smelling like a pig. Instead, he took a bath. It was his second bath in less than a week. Then he led the pig to Myra's. Igor was there with his pig as well. "These are two of the finest pigs I've ever seen," Myra's father declared. He was also impressed with Elia, who seemed to have grown bigger and stronger in the last 2 months. "I used to think you were a good-for-nothing book reader," he said, "but I see now you could be an excellent mud wrestler." "May I marry your daughter?" Elia boldly asked. "First, I must weigh the pigs." Alas, poor Elia should have carried his pig up the mountain one last time. The two pigs weighed exactly the same. Stanley's blister had ripped open and new blisters formed. He kept changing his grip on the shovel to try to avoid the pain. Finally, he removed his cap and held it between the shaft of the shovel and his raw hands. This helped, but digging was harder because the cap would slip and slide. The sun beat down on his unprotected head and neck. Though he tried to convince himself otherwise, he'd been aware for a while that his piles of dirt were too close to his hole. The piles were outside his 5-foot circle, but he could see he was going to run out of room. Still, he pretended otherwise and kept adding more dirt to the piles that he would eventually have to move. The problem was that when the dirt was in the ground, it was compacted. It expanded when it was excavated. The piles were a lot bigger than his hole was deep. It was either now or later. Reluctantly, he climbed up out of his hole and once again dug his shovel into his previous dirt dig. Myra's father got down on his hands and knees and closely examined each pig, tail, and snout. "Those are two of the finest pigs I've ever seen," he said at last. "How am I to decide? I have only one daughter." "Why not let Myra decide?" suggested Elia. "That's preposterous," exclaimed Igor, expelling saliva as he spoke. "Myra is just an empty-headed girl," said her father. "How could she possibly decide when I, her father, can't?" "She knows how she feels in her heart," says Elia. Myra's father rubbed his chin. Then he laughed and said, "Why not?" He slapped Isla on the back. "It doesn't matter to me. A pig is a pig." He summoned his daughter. Elia blushed when Myra entered the room. "Good afternoon, Myra," he said. She looked at him. "You're Elia, right?" she asked. "Myra," said her father. "Elia and Igor have each offered a pig for your hand in marriage. It doesn't matter to me. A pig is a pig. So I will let you make the choice. Whom do you wish to marry?" Myra looked confused. "You want me to decide?" "That's right, my blossom," said her father. "Gee, I don't know," said Myra. "Which pig weighs more?" "They both weigh the same," said the father. "Golly," said Myra. "I guess I choose Elia." "No, Igor. No, Elia. No, Igor. Oh, I know. I'll think of a number between 1 and 10, and I'll marry whoever guesses the closest number. Okay? I'm ready." 10, guessed Igor. Elia said nothing. "Elia," said Myra, "what number do you guess?" Elia didn't pick a number. "Marry Igor," he muttered. "You could keep my pig as a wedding present." The next time the water truck came, it was driven by Mr. Podensky, who had also brought sack lunches. Stanley sat with him back against a pile of dirt and ate. He had a bologna sandwich, potato chips, and a large chocolate chip cookie. "How you doing?" asked Magnet. "Not real good," said Stanley. "Well, the first hole's the hardest," Magnet said. Stanley took a long, deep breath. He couldn't afford to dawdle. He was way behind the others, and the sun just kept getting hotter. It wasn't even noon yet. But he didn't know if he had the strength to stand up. He thought about quitting. He wondered what he would do to him. What could they do with him? His clothes were soaked with sweat. In school, he had learned that sweating was good for him. It was nature's way of keeping him cool. So why was he so hot? Using his shovel for support, he managed to get to his feet. "Where are we supposed to go to the bathroom?" he asked Magnet. Magnet gestured with his arms to the great expanse around them. "Pick a hole, any hole," he said. Stanley staggered across the lake, almost falling over a dirt pile. Behind him, he heard Magnet say, "But first make sure nothing's living in it." After leaving Myra's house, Elia wandered aimlessly through the town until he found himself down by the wharf. He sat on the edge of the pier and stared down into the cold black water. He could not understand how Myra had trouble deciding between him and Igor. He thought she loved him. Even if she didn't love him, couldn't she see what a fool person Igor was? It was like Madame Zeroni had said. Her head was empty as a flower pot. Some men were gathering on another dock and went to see what was going on. A sign read, "Deck hands wanted, free passage to America." He had no sailing experience, but the ship's captain signed him aboard. The captain could see that Elia was a man of great strength. Not everyone could carry a full-grown pig up the side of a mountain. And it wasn't until the ship had cleared the harbor and was heading out across the Atlantic that he suddenly remembered his promise to carry Madame Zeroni up the mountain. He felt terrible. He wasn't afraid of the curse. He thought that it was a lot of nonsense. He actually felt bad because he knew Madame Zeroni had wanted to drink from the stream before she died. Zero was the smallest kid in Group D, but he was the first one to finish digging. "You're finished?" Stanley asked. Zero said nothing. Stanley walked to Zero's hole and watched him measure it with his shovel. The top of his hole was a perfect circle, and the sides were smooth and steep. Not one dirt clod more than necessary had been removed from the earth. Zero pulled himself up to the surface. He didn't even smile. He looked down at this perfectly dug hole, spat in it, then turned and headed back to the camp compound. "Zero's one weird dude," said Zigzag. Stanley would have laughed, but he didn't have the strength. Zigzag had to be the weirdest dude Stanley had ever seen. He had a long, skinny neck and a big, round head with wild, frizzy blonde hair that stuck out in all directions. His head seemed to bob up and down on his neck, like it was on a spring. Armpit was the second one to finish digging. He also spat into his big hole before heading back to the camp compound. One by one, Stanley watched each of the boys spit into their hole and return to the camp compound. Stanley kept digging. His hole was almost up to his shoulders, although it was hard to tell exactly where ground level was because his dirt piles completely surrounded the hole. The deeper he got, the harder it was to raise the dirt up and out of the hole. Once again, he realized he was going to have to move the piles. His cape was stained with blood from his hands. He felt like he was been digging his own grave. In America, Elia learned to speak English. He fell in love with a woman named Sarah Miller. She could push a plow, milk a goat, and most importantly, think for herself. She and Elia often stayed up half the night talking and laughing together. Their life was not easy. Elia worked hard, but bad luck seemed to follow him everywhere. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He remembered Madame Zeroni telling him that she had a son in America. Elia was forever looking for him. He'd walk up to the complete strangers and ask if they knew someone named Zeroni, or had ever heard of anyone named Zeroni. No one did. Elia wasn't sure what he'd do if he ever found Madame Zeroni's son anyway. Carry him up the mountains and sing the Ping lullaby to him? After his barn was struck by lightning for the third time, he told Sarah about his broken promise to Madame Zeroni. "I'm worse than a pig thief," he said. "You should leave me and find someone who isn't cursed." "I'm not leaving you," said Sarah, "but I want you to do one thing for me." "Anything," said Elia. Sarah smiled. Sing me the pig lullaby. He sang it for her. Her eyes sparkled. That's so pretty. What does it mean? Elliot tried his best to translate it from Latvian into English, but it wasn't the same. It rhymes in Latvian, he told her. I could tell, said Sarah. A year later, their child was born. Sarah named him Stanley because she noticed that Stanley was Yelnats spelled backwards. Sarah changed the words of the pig lullaby so they rhymed, and every night she sang it to little Stanley. Stanley's hole was as deep as his shovel, but not quite wide enough on the bottom. He grimaced as he sliced off a chunk of dirt, then raised it up and flung it into a pile. He laid his shovel back down on the bottom of the hole, and to his surprise, it fit. He rotated it and only had a chip off a few chunks of dirt here and there before he could lay flat across the hole in every direction. He heard the water truck approaching and felt a strange sense of pride of being able to show Mr. Sir or Mr. Podensky that he had dug his first hole. He put his hands on the rim and tried to pull himself up. He couldn't do it. His arms were too weak to lift his heavy body. He used his legs to help, but he just didn't have any sort of strength. He was trapped in the hole. It was almost funny, but he wasn't in the mood to laugh. Stanley, he heard Mr. Podensky call. Using his shovel, he dug 2-foot holes in the hole of the wall. He climbed out to see Mr. Podensky walking over to him. I was afraid you fainted, Mr. Podensky said. You wouldn't have been the first. I'm finished, Stanley said, putting his blood-spotted cap back on his head. All right, said Mr. Podensky, raising his hands for a high five, but Stanley ignored it. He didn't have the strength. Mr. Podensky lowered his hand and looked down at Stanley's hole. Well done, he said. You want to ride back? Stanley shook his head. I'll walk. Mr. Podensky climbed back into his truck without filling Stanley's canteen. Stanley waited for him to drive away, then took another look at his hole. He knew it was nothing to be proud of, but he felt proud nonetheless. He sucked up his last bit of saliva and spat. And that's where we're going to stop today.